big question in terms of trying to resolve today, to have mounted this attack against the United States, though, as always, the intelligence community has gone almost immediately to Osama bin Laden as a principal suspect. And we don't yet know why they have done that, but it seems to be something of a tradition. It was great to see. It was really great to see the members of Congress gather and sing God Bless America, and to tell the country and the world that the country's hanging together. But there was a time earlier today when the capital city was just closing down as absolutely fast as they could get it closed down. Take a look at this report from ABC's Michelle Norris.
With the Pentagon burning in the distance, the nation's capital was evacuated.
This is the first time we had a mandatory evacuation of the Capitol and the House and Senate office buildings.
Bewildered employees got out as fast as they could, while key congressional leaders were carefully whisked away to safe and undisclosed locations. Top leaders from throughout the administration were immediately placed under special protection.
The leaders are in undisclosed locations for their own safety and to ensure that we can reconstitute decision-making when that's appropriate.
The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe.
It's all part of official Washington's civil defense plan to ensure that the federal government continues to function smoothly even while the nation is under attack.
And they basically have a playbook initially to assess how serious is this threat. Do we need to have a lot of people move very far away from Washington, or do we just need to have a few key backup people get outside of the immediate downtown area?
During the Cold War, the federal government developed an elaborate evacuation plan to make sure top leaders would survive a nuclear attack by taking them to a series of secret bunkers just outside Washington. Today, that wasn't necessary, but nonetheless, the nation's top decision makers remain under very heavy protection.
Making sure that the federal government continues to function, I think, is very important in a time of crisis because it reassures the public that somebody is in charge and the situation is well in hand.
And in today's time of crisis, Americans, as well as many elsewhere in the world, will be looking for that reassurance. Michelle Norris, ABC News, Washington.
Information is pouring into our newsroom from everywhere, trying to understand this. Here's a message from a friend who happens to be an architectural engineer who knows something about the World Trade Center and who believes that a member of the family may have been killed in the Trade Center at all. It's been impossible for... We've only had one person, at least on this broadcast, identified all day, and that is the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, who managed to call her husband from the aircraft that was hijacked and then subsequently attacked the Pentagon. But he, an engineer and an architect, speculates here that the heat above the crash site on the Twin Trade Towers may have indeed caused the building above to melt, just simply collapsing in itself and putting enormous weight on the rest of the building below, which could not possibly stand it. And the steel columns which go up through the building, built to code at best, would only be able, he believes, to have been able to stand an hour and a half of intense fire like this, pressing down on the rest of the building until it finally was able to give way. It was a very well-built building, probably better, given its size and the attention and everything else, much better than similar buildings built today, because it was the first of its style. And as we know, in many American cities as well as overseas, there are a lot more daring architectural structures of this magnitude in many parts of the world today. And in Asia particularly, people building these astonishingly high buildings as showplaces, almost a competition going on in the rest of the world as to who can build the tallest, most daring building. Well, there's a very simple, long box structure built well, according to the engineers who know it. And the heat of that fire from those penetrations of the two aircraft, in his view, may have made the difference. It will take us time to find out. John Miller, latest.
There's really no change other than rescue operations have started now at the World Trade Center, ones that were hampered because of the impending collapse of 7 World Trade Center, the third building to go down. Bodies have started to be brought to the morgue, but only in very small numbers now. That's going to be a massive operation that continues. And of course, as we've all discussed, the mounting of a massive federal investigation in tandem with the intelligence community's assistance to the military to try to put a name to this.
I wonder if anybody else is as aware as I am at the moment. I'm sure people are aware as I am at the moment of previous investigations we have done of far lesser incidents. Attack on TWA 800 is one. The investigation at the Al-Khobar Towers, which was conducted by retired General Wayne Downing, who's with us in our Washington Bureau. We'll talk to him after the president tonight. All of these investigations have gone on and on and on and on, and many of them just really didn't resolve anything in the final analysis.
Yet many of them did. The largest acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, ironically the bombing of the World Trade Center, the attacks in East Africa have been solved to the extent that people have been charged, many have been brought back to this country. The FBI actually has a terrific track record that way in chasing these leads out to the ends of the earth. We were talking about something a minute ago, though, that is part of the fog of war in these things. After the Al-Khobar explosion, there were intercepts of people calling Osama bin Laden's headquarters to congratulate him. And in these intercepts, there was no, he didn't say, well, thanks, but it wasn't me. Now the government is taking the position that it was the Iranians. So you really have to sort through the information very carefully before you choose your suspects.
Yeah, I just simply wish to make the point that it's going to take a long time, and that the impatience that we all feel about striking back at somebody who's done this thing to the country is not going to be requited, I think, for very long. ABC's Pierre Thomas, by the way, reports that his FBI sources are telling him that several people on board both two of the planes which went down, this would be the one of the Pentagon, at least one of those coming either to New York or to Pennsylvania, were able to get out on their cell phones and call their relatives. And they described horrific scenes on board the aircraft, people being attacked and stabbed on board the aircraft itself. We've heard at least one piece of information that the weapon of choice, at least on one of the aircraft, was a box cutter, what professionals and sometimes amateur use with the razor blade through it, that enables you to open up cardboard boxes in a hurry, and has, of course, been a weapon of crime with which we're all familiar. And as John Miller, who knows more about these things than most, pointed out easier, you take a plastic one on board and it's very hard for a security device to detect. But I want to go quickly to Midtown New York City again, just before we go to the president, and get a quick update from Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Peter, I'm standing out here, and as you can see around me, there's a dramatic change in activity, and I don't know how much you could hear earlier when we were telling you about it, but we have 6 bulldozers down here now. We have an entire line, an entire street full of EMS crews and ambulances. It appears they have got the lights up. The generators are working, and it's very possible they could be moving in soon for some kind of activity actually on the site. And I've got Don Daler here with me. We've been dividing up all the duties here, and he's been down to the scene. And also J.D. Halpern, who said he's just a volunteer who came in from California and was around the area. I just wanted to know, how much fire is there? You said you were just at ground zero. How much fire is left?
Well, the building 7, there was no fire there whatsoever, but there was one truck putting water on the building, but it's collapsed completely. And then the other building that there were some flames still coming up was in World Trade Center 1, but not a lot.
And you said you saw melted tour buses, melted cars?
The cars that were right down there, it was just unbelievable. They were twisted and melted into nothing. The debris is just unbelievable. And then you can see fire trucks and police vehicles that were down there early, that all their windows, the windshields are completely blown out must have been from when debris dropped.
We can even see from here that the smoke seems to have gone down, Don. And I want to repeat, Peter, because J.D. was saying, as well as Don earlier, in case you didn't hear us, that it is carpeted up there. It is ankle deep in papers.
In some places, papers and debris go up 2 or 3 feet high. You have to wade through in some areas.
These are financial documents.
Yeah, the ones I looked at, many of them were financial documents, very personal documents, that when I saw the first explosion that hit, there was just a snow cascade of paper, and the whole area down there is just coated with it.
Well, Peter, again, we'll let you know as soon as we can confirm that they are going in to the site. We should say that the mayor was here just a minute ago and drove by, waved at us, but would not stop. Back to you.
Diane, just exactly where are you?
We're about 4.5 blocks from ground zero.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane Sawyer. Don Daler. Don Daler did a wonderful job for us earlier today, giving us some sense of what was happening as close as you could get to the scene. And I'm also joined now by ABC's George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all today. And so we'll have a chance to revisit that scene from a variety of locations after we hear from the President, because it's 8:30 Eastern Time, 3:30 in the West, and we are about to hear from the President of the United States. I think most of you know that the President has been on something of a strange journey today. He went off to Florida to promote education. He was in Florida when this occurred. He was then literally taken up by the security apparatus which surrounds him, and taken off first to Louisiana, where he touched down at an Air Force base. We didn't know what was going to happen next. He was then taken off to Nebraska, to the old Strategic Air Command, one of the old Strategic Air Command bases from the Cold War days, put into a bunker or down the rabbit hole, as it was described to us. ABC's Ann Compton was with him all day and talked all day about the struggle between the security and the political apparatus, whether the President can get back to Washington. Well, the President is back in Washington now, and there has been no time in his presidency, and there may never be a time like this again, when it has been so important what he says to the country, because I think we all know at moments like this, the country looks to the President of the United States for understanding, for knitting the country together, and some presidents do it brilliantly, and some do not. Here is Mr. Bush. Okay, this was a, well, the President isn't sitting there trying to think about what to say, I can assure you. The President is sitting there because someone on network television has sat him down and said, we'll cue you in 30 seconds, Mr. Bush. And so, as awkward as it looks to him, this is what we've expected him to do. And now here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
The President of the United States, when he is in many respects needed most. And we've been joined by George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all day and who very quickly picked up, George, that the President may have given us a hint in his first couple of lines there to the magnitude of this.
He said thousands of lives that were suddenly ended. The first number we've had all day by an official verifying the magnitude of the casualties. Thousands of lives suddenly ended. He also did a lot of other things in this very short speech, Peter. He gave voice to the anger that many Americans are feeling. He talked about the quiet, unyielding anger of America, and then was very pointed in giving reassurance. Military is prepared. The emergency teams are on their way. Government will be back to business tomorrow. Our economy will be back to business tomorrow. And then finally, Peter, what I found most interesting in the section about where he talked about retaliation, he said America would make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them, which is a message to any state which may be supporting these terrorists who are behind this act.
Well, which creates a huge dilemma for the United States of America, because if it is discovered, as we've talked several times throughout the day, that a state, and I've forgotten who it was, a former director of the CIA perhaps earlier today, who said he couldn't believe that a state would actually support Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, who said directly he couldn't believe that a state would actively support an act such as this, though it may have over periods of time, as Iran and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan have all been suspected to do, give collateral or indirect support down through the years.
The word that the President used was so expansive, Peter. It wasn't just supported or funded. It was any who harbored them, who may have given them sanctuary at any time. That is a very open-ended commitment.
And then I thought, by the way, also, if I may add, that this President particularly, who feels so strongly about his Christianity, felt it a good time to say, to quote those lines from Psalm 23, even though I walk, or yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, because God is with me. And that will just sit so appropriately, I believe, in the minds and the sentiments of many Americans tonight. And we've felt throughout the day, we've heard scattered reports of people going to churches and saying a prayer for those people who may or may not be lost, and for the families of those people around the country. Because don't forget, relatives in these locations have relatives all over the country. This is a total engagement with the nation. And I think you pretty much covered it all, except for one thing, George. The President talked also about the sense of safety and security of young people in America, particularly, who were threatened today. And we heard that from people around the country today, people who simply could not believe, as it was the case at Oklahoma City, that this was happening in the United States. It's always something that happens somewhere else.
Or in the movies. And this is far worse than any plot that anyone could have ever devised. And I think I was downtown, as you mentioned today, Peter, so it was more surreal there, almost because people were so determined to get back to the normal life, even as all of downtown was being closed off. So I was a little bit cut off from what was happening around the country, but you did feel it down there.
But I think this is very characteristic of New York, and probably would have been characteristic of any other major community in the country, any other community as well. Terry Moran, who covers Mr. Bush for us today, but ironically wasn't with him today as he went on this education trip, not on normal. I think you are now, Terry, back at your regular location on the north lawn of the White House. Does that mean the White House has loosened up just a little bit?
Well, it has, Peter. The White House has leapt to life after several hours of the White House compound itself and the blocks around it in Washington essentially being deserted, a ghost town really coming in here. It is now a beehive of activity with government officials, cabinet secretaries. The president, of course, has returned. The First Lady has returned, and they are now working well into the night on this crisis. The president that you saw in these remarks, we are told, is the man who absorbed this tragedy today. He was described as steely throughout the day, as someone who did not react with great emotion or anger, who was able to see the pictures that America saw while he was in the air in Air Force One and reacted very seriously, very soberly, pretty much as we saw him tonight.
Now, you say that the White House is up and running again, full in action, though the White House is clearly never completely out of action, no matter where it is. But what do you actually mean by that? What are they doing?
Well, what we are seeing right now is the president and his top advisors huddled in the Oval Office and in the study off the Oval Office. We saw cabinet secretaries and FEMA Director Joe Albaugh were here earlier, and Joe Albaugh is still here. He is briefing the president on the emergency response teams that he's sent out. The president is receiving information from his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. You just see a great deal of activity. And you're right, this was not a completely deserted White House. Vice President Cheney was here, as was Dr. Rice, through the day. And in fact, we are told that the president, while he was in the air, had an open line of communication to the vice president throughout the day.
And Terry, you know as well as I do that much of the country had this feeling of helplessness today. As the president said, our sense of safety and security as a national entity were attacked today. They must have been just as frustrated because they didn't really know any more in the White House than we did on the outside.
They did not, and the president's response and the Secret Service's response to the events as they developed was determined by misinformation sometime. At one point, there was a report of a car bomb going off at the State Department. At another point, there was a report that this plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was on its way towards Camp David, and those things helped determine the Secret Service's decision to keep the president out of Washington, to put in place this plan to take him to Air Force bases which are predetermined and keep him away from harm.
So the staff works on at the White House to get some sense of what is it. Thanks, Terry. I'll come back to you in just a minute, man. We've been joined in Washington by Leon Panetta, a former White House chief of staff for Bill Clinton, now out of government, back for the most part in California, if I remember correctly, Mr. Panetta.
That's correct.
What's the White House chief of staff do at a moment like this? Where do you reach? What buttons do you try to push? Who do you try to connect with? Are you in some respects at the mercy of the military and intelligence establishment at the moment?
Well, you should not be. What you should do is try to organize the White House team so that the main focus is in the White House. You have your security people, your military people, your defense people. You have your national security advisor, your State Department people. I think it's better to run this kind of crisis directly from the White House so the president is in charge of not only what happened, but what to do.
Take us back to Oklahoma City and to the attack on the barracks residence at Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia. What am I, 96, 97? I apologize, I've forgotten.
I believe about 96.
Were you just immensely frustrated that you just didn't know anything?
Well, Oklahoma City, the first time we heard of Oklahoma City, it was on television. And we were sitting near the Oval Office watching television reports of what had happened. And it was only after it was first reported on television that we began to get some telephonic communication about what had taken place. But you feel rather helpless because you know a tragedy has taken place, but you don't know all of the facts and why it happened. And you know, Oklahoma's a good example of not jumping to conclusions, because in Oklahoma City, we had all kinds of thoughts that this was a Middle East terrorist effort in Oklahoma, and it turned out not to be. So I hope this country has the patience to carefully investigate, determine who really did this, and then respond.
To be open about it, we've said this several times today and reminded people in Oklahoma City that our tendency towards prejudice emerged pretty quickly and was proved to be wrong. As you have tried, I assume, to talk to people around the world today, have you picked up anything which contributes to the understanding of this?
Not really. I mean, you have You have obviously your suspicions about who's involved, but we are a country that believes first and foremost in justice. That's what distinguishes us from the people who carried out these acts. So I hope we take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who did it, and then take appropriate action. That's what a great democracy does.
But there is, Mr. Panetta, tremendous pressure on the president to strike back at somebody. We've struck back at Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan, didn't get him, spent a fortune, and didn't accomplish very much. Is the pressure on the president huge to do something in order to satisfy the anger and the frustration of the American people?
The pressure is incredible, Peter. It's coming from politicians on Capitol Hill. It's coming from constituents. It's coming from, I'm sure, many in the public who want to strike back in some way. The president is the leader of this country. He's got to take the time to make sure we do what's right. And what's right in this instance is to take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who are the culprits, and then take appropriate action. That's been the course of action that the United States has taken in the past, and it's the course of action we've got to take now.
Thanks very much, Leon Panetta, for joining us, reminding us that the president's resolve will be tested, but also so will be his patience. We've talked a lot about the attack on Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1990s when American military personnel posted in Saudi Arabia were the victims of a terrorist attack. And the retired General Wayne Downing is with us in the Washington Bureau. He was the senior military officer assigned to write the report on the Al-Khobar towers. And General Downing, you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, you are. There's one note in the note that was handed to me a while ago about you. You were responsible for making recommendations about making U.S. citizens safe from worldwide terrorist attacks. What were your recommendations, and is there anything that happened today which suggested your recommendations were not followed?
No, I think in this particular case, Khobar Towers was a surprise. It should not have been, because we had a bombing over there in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. And Khobar, after that bombing, was assessed to be the #1 target in the Middle East. And in the subsequent bombing in June, we found ourselves surprised, a lack of situational awareness. I don't think that's the case today. I think people in our Congress, people in the executive branch, certainly the National Commission on Terrorism that I served on last year, it was a congressionally appointed commission, pointed out that we had a serious problem with the possibility of an attack by weapons of mass destruction. And if we saw anything today, we saw an attack with weapons of mass destruction.
General Downing, I've asked this question several times today. Perhaps you wouldn't mind answering it as well. There is a sense that the intelligence community or the counter-terrorist organizations in the country were consumed with the fear or the awareness of a chemical or biological weapons attack on the United States. And this kind of conventional attack got less than full appreciation, the potential of it. Is that a fair observation?
I don't think that's fair. I think certainly we have been concerned about chemical and biological, but I think the experts in this business have always felt that our greatest threat came from a kinetic energy weapon or an event like this, a suicide, if not aircraft, certainly a suicide bomber, suicide truck.
And do you agree with others today, particularly in the intelligence community, both in it currently and even some members of Congress who said the failure here is the United States' emphasis on human intelligence around the world, that one of the mistakes the United States made was to downgrade the degree of human intelligence that people thought was necessary?
Well, this is a complicated subject. Certainly when the American barracks in Beirut was bombed in 1983, one of the findings that Admiral Long came up with on his investigation was we had a problem with intelligence. Certainly one of the things that came out of Khobar was we didn't have enough human intelligence. We did not have tactical warning. But I think what we came up with was the fact that the terrorists we're up against are not going to give us the opportunity to get tactical warning. And so it's a very, very difficult subject. Now, to be fair to the intelligence community, they have made Herculean efforts over the last several years to improve our access to tactical information. And it's a very, very difficult subject. It's a difficult subject because we as Americans are very uneasy sometimes with the type of people we have to deal with to get this kind of intelligence. So on the one hand, we want the information, but on the other hand, we get very upset sometimes with some of the dirty, rotten people you must deal with who have this kind of information. And I think we're in a new era now. I mean, I think we've seen a formal declaration of war on the United States, although it shouldn't surprise us. We've had a lot of people saying this, our enemies, people who hate us, for many years. But now we see a manifestation on a scale that is almost unbelievable.
Downing, I very much appreciate you waiting for us and taking the time to tell us, to talk to us. Is the former Commander-in-Chief of the Special Operations Unit, is General Downing, and he wrote the COBAR's report, the report which investigated the attack on Americans in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. We're going to go to, in just a second now, to ABC's Robert Krulwich and then talk to the engineer, or one of the engineers who worked on the trade tower, see if we can understand what it was that brought these buildings down today. But first, some more fairly late news from John Miller. John?
Since the rescue workers are now first starting to work that scene, they're starting to have some very interesting results. Two Port Authority police officers, the Port Authority being the entity that runs the World Trade Center, have been found trapped in the rubble. There is a team of police officers trying to dig them out. They're apparently alive. A strange case, a 911 operator in Pennsylvania says she's received a call from people trapped in the rubble 40 feet from the Vista Hotel or the Millennium Hotel. They say they're near a fountain.
On the west side of Manhattan.
Yes,
right.
In the World Trade Center complex. And they're calling out from where they're trapped beneath the rubble to a 911, perhaps on a Pennsylvania cell phone, but that went to an operator in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of triangulate where they are to get to them. So things are picking up there. They've also brought in dogs from all the counties around the city to aid in helping to sniff victims out. Exactly, as we've said before today, exactly they do in the case of an earthquake. People are now underground, and dogs are just the best thing you have in trying to locate them. Yet, as we've learned so often in modern times, in recent times, in Columbine, the role of the cell phone in modern disaster is incredible. From the people who called out from the airplane, something we really didn't expect, an odd development, to people perhaps calling out from the rubble, if that's a legitimate call to the Pennsylvania operator. Great. John Miller, will come back to you. Now to try to examine the building. ABC's Robert Krulwich has put together a piece on the structural engineering of the World Trade Centers, perhaps better able help us to understand that when these two aircraft hit these two towers today, exactly what was going on. Robert?
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength, and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Well, that report, as we look at New York City at night, which has a still quality about it tonight. It's a city of light at night, as so many American cities are, but there's a still, almost calm look of it from the sky. It's anything but that on the ground. But this is the second time from Robert Krulwich and also from some architect engineers we talked to a little earlier that say it was the heat which caused the building to collapse, because that the steel at the top of the building would maybe have only been able to sustain an hour and a half of intense fire, and then the steel begins, as Robert points out, so clearly collapse upon itself all the way down to the bottom. I think we have with us on the phone or in person from Seattle, John Magnuson, who is an engineer. John, are you there? John Magnuson, who is with the company that actually built the World Trade Center towers. John, have you heard our two layman explanations tonight of what it was we think collapsed the building, and do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I need to say one thing. At the time of the design of the World Trade Center, that was in the mid-1960s, and I was in 6th grade. So to kind of put in perspective how much time has passed since this design was actually completed. But the description of the fact that steel, when it gets up to 1,500, 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, that it loses its strength is accurate. The buildings actually survived the impact of both the planes, and it was really the fire that finally created the disaster.
And the upper floor fell on the next floor down, which fell on the next floor, and the sheer accumulation of weight just forced the whole building to collapse on itself.
Right there, from the videotape, and I can only go from what I've seen on television, but the videotape showed that several of the upper floors fell onto the next lower floor that was still intact. And once that happens, there's going to be an instant overload situation, and then it will fail. And then that will drop down to the next floor into another instant overload situation. And so the floors just progressively collapse down all the way to the bottom.
I appreciate very much the fact that you were very young in the mid-1960s when the trade towers were built. Though I've heard it said earlier today that they in fact, were stronger, more sensible structures than many of the more daring shaped buildings that are being built in parts of the world today.
Right. The term that structural engineers use is redundancy. And the World Trade Center towers really set a new standard in redundancy. And that's why those airplanes were able to crash into the towers without causing the structural failure. The buildings were still standing. And then the problem was the fire and the jet fuel. And in normal buildings, all the steel is protected with fireproofing, and there's sprinkler systems, but they're not designed to protect against a jet fuel fire inside of a building.
Can you be a little more precise what you mean by redundancy?
Redundancy is that if you have a structural element that is damaged and is no longer able to carry the load, that load is able to be passed on to other elements or other columns or other beams within the building. And the columns on the World Trade Center, they were spaced at 39 inches on center all the way across each face.
What does that mean, 39 inches at center?
Every 3 feet 3 inches there was a column that supported the building. So they were very closely spaced together. Many buildings, the columns are 10 or 15 feet apart or more. And so having these very close spaced columns on the outside created a lot of redundancy. That's why there was able to be a hole in the side. If you go back and look at the tapes, there was a tremendous hole in the side of the building, and it didn't collapse until the fire brought it down.
And Trade Tower number 7, which was the last to go, which was a building 47 stories high, do you have any sense of why it ultimately collapsed? Was it the concussion of the other buildings collapsing which undermined it?
I'm not familiar with that building. We were not involved in that building, and I haven't seen any of the details on that yet.
So aside from your horror, which I assume you share with the rest of us today, when you look at what has happened today, do you learn something?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because if you take that much of a load and that much jet fuel and you put it into a building, there's very little that you can do. And really, I think the solution to this will be to keep the planes and keep these attacks away from the doorsteps of these buildings.
John Nance, who's our aviation analyst, said to us several hours ago when speculating, as we all are in many cases, about who may have been involved, said he would not be surprised if somewhere in the world there was a structural engineer who was part of this operation. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense. I sure would hope not. Every structural engineer is dedicated to preserving public safety. And just the thought that someone would take that training and use it for evil purposes just really disgusts me.
Is there anything I've missed, John? No? Okay. I'm very grateful for the time. What's it like up there in Seattle tonight? People feeling exactly the same thing people here in New York City are feeling?
Yes, and there was certainly a lot of apprehension during the day. Many of the buildings were evacuated just as precautionary measures. But there's this same empty feeling in your stomach about the whole thing. And just watching, people, of course, were glued to the coverage on the television sets.
Well, thank you.
From ABC 7 News, this is a special report. Continuing coverage, America Under Attack.
And we want to bring you up to date once again on the local situation in the face of the president's reassurances just a half hour ago that it will be business as usual here in the nation's capital starting tomorrow. I'm Kathleen Matthews.
And I'm Maureen Bunyan. And one of the places where it has been declared business will go on as usual is the Pentagon. And our Jim Clark is there tonight with the latest on the situation, the rescue attempts, and of course the fire there. Jim?
Maureen, as the president was addressing the nation tonight on these terrorist attacks, flames began shooting through the roof of the Pentagon in more than half a dozen places. And we're going to ask our